I'm being filmed. That's good. I like it. I would have had my makeup put on.
Hair and makeup.
Yeah. So this is Art of Aloha number
12?
9. It was 9 for me. I don't think I was from
Oh, okay.
the first
No, I
one.
think you just missed the first one.
Oh, so it's 11. Boy, I'm getting old. It's good to be here. I know we've not met before, and this book will help you a little bit because it is this booklet. It's not really a book because to read an art book, it's kind of confusing. You don't know where to go and so forth. But this will give you just a little bit of a sense of what I am and what I can do when I've done and so forth. First of all, what I'm doing today is very important. I am in the middle of a school which is called hyperrealism. It's a school that derived itself from the school of photorealism, which originated in the late 80s. And it all began very simply by one artist by the name of Chuck Close noticing something very unusual. So when people look at a book of photography, once in a while somebody would say, look at this photograph, look how real that looks. Why don't we do it when we look at each other? Why don't we say, hey, look how real she looks? Oh, look. We say how pretty or how ugly, but we never say how real. Why does it happen when this is a photograph? So he decided to do an experiment, and he covered one eye, exposing only one eye, just like a camera. It's a one-eye monster, or one-eye bandit, and then set up a still life, and then painted by focusing only on one item. When he finished painting the painting, his wife, he was married at the time, walked in for about 30 feet, and she said, oh my God, what a beautiful photograph. Not until she came close, she realized by the brush strokes that it was not a photograph, it was actually a painting, but by the illusion, because it was done just with one eye, it gave the depth and perception of a photograph. So now he solved the issue of why, and that's how the school began. So when I met him, he suggested to me, because I use airbrush, and in a moment I'll tell you why I use an airbrush, he said to me, you know, this school, this technique, or this philosophy be perfect for you because using airbrush there will never be unintended shadows. Using conventional brush, you create strokes, and the strokes have texture in paint, and then they create shadows that you don't want to have. Sometimes you do. So you will be able to work any which way, and everything on the canvas or on the board, in this case, in my case, will be just yours. So I just started doing it, and I slowly got a little more involved and more elaborate, and you'll see some of the works in this particular exhibit. I took it one step further, and one step further meaning that I became a little more elaborate and I became a little more intriguing and so forth. Airbrush. As the world was turning, I'm 68 years old, so it's been turning several times in my life. I've noticed something when I was living in New York is that the days of artists sitting in coffee shop arguing politics and art gone. The intimacy of sitting with another artist, the smell, aroma of the room, remembering the moment by remember the alcohol smell in this restaurant we sat and we argued, it's all gone. In my days, people started communicating through computers, through fax machines and so forth, and it really bothered me that nobody talks about it. Nobody says what happened to the days that we sat and we argued about art. It's all gone. So I decided that I will commemorate this somehow. And by sheer coincidence, I was introduced to an airbrush. And an airbrush was invented at the turn of the century to manipulate photographs that were very poorly printed by introducing a little darker color to create depth in it. And most all photographs 100 years ago were actually airbrushed. They were not, the photography was so crude at the time. And I was playing with it. Next thing you know, I met an illustrator who taught me how to use colors with it. Next thing you know, I started painting with it. And the reason I started painting with this is because it was a perfect symbol of what the world has become. We became sterile. We no longer spend time together arguing about art and politics, as I said before. We do everything indirectly. And that symbol of the airbrush painting instead of me. I propel the paint to the canvas. I don't touch the paint. In a sense, I do exactly what society is right now. So the airbrush is not a tool of choice or the tool of symbolism of where I am in life, where historically this artist lived. I don't date my painting, but I guarantee you that centuries from now, somebody will look at the painting and will say, this was painted in the 21st century because the airbrush was not used prior to that. And that will be like a stepping stone for me. And I do love the airbrushing because it allows me to do things that you could not normally able to do through conventional painting. And also because I came to Washington because I was a colorist, and the Colorist School of Art originated in Washington. So I moved from New York to Washington to paint there. By the way, all the famous colorists have passed away. I'm the last one that left. And since color was my primary interest in works, I experimented with glass and acrylic and discovered that I can manipulate colors through light, and that's why I started sculpting. And we have small examples of what I do in sculpture here on this show, but if you go and search and research, you'll see some monumental works and large works of art that explain exactly that.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, in this little booklet, which you did not see while not here, so this is kind of a digest of many different things about me. It's all set up in a simple matter. You can go inside, and by the way, if you want to go to our trip to Israel, you can one of those. We're doing a wonderful experience. And by the way, there's a movie about me, which is on Netflix right now. It's called Ladders. You can get that. Yeah, you should have that movie here. I don't know. It's been done by Viacom.
We have it.
Harry Belafonte was the narrator. And in the back, actually, this is a scene from the movie. I do commission work, which is sometimes functional. In this case, this was done for Donald Trump. There was a table, and this chair was done for Miss Wilson from Wilson, I think, from Boston, right? And it's a rotating instrument underneath. She uses it actually to put makeup on. She sits on it, whatever. And this humidor was designed for Michael Jordan originally. There I am with this humidor here. And this was designed for President Yeltsin's 60th birthday and his first summit between Russia and the United States. It was the first summit ever between Russia and the United States. There were summits between the Soviet Union and the United States, not them. And I designed that. It's called the White One. So anyhow, it's a lot of little anecdotal stuff inside, but it gives you an idea of what I do, how I do it, and so forth. And if anybody wants to do it more in depth, then obviously you have to go to the books to get more involved things. When I start the process of painting, I need to come up with a concept and idea. Once I came up with the concept and idea, since it takes anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks to do a painting, I spend a few days on making a little study. I take a little board, which is 8 inches by 12 inches normally because it's pre-cut from the end. It's gessoed, and then after it's gessoed, it's sanded, and it's gessoed again, sanded again. Then I take color pencils and I do a drawing, usually something that I came up with, and sometimes I use little photographs to do little elements in it. I do a little flower, and by the way, if anybody comes to you and says, well, you know, I noticed that this flower and this leaf are not botanically compatible, you have to remind them that I'm not a botanical artist. I'm just an artist that invents and reinvents items. I do it for different reasons, so it's not anatomically correct for a good reason. So I sit and I draw it, and then I introduce watercolors to it, then I introduce a little airbrush into it, and that creates a study. And I know that you have a couple of studies in here. I live with that study, and after a while, I decide if I want to make a painting out of it or not. If I want to make a painting out of it, I will take it to the studio and I will work from it using the decimal point system which Da Vinci used. You do a grid, and through that grid you duplicate it on a larger scale, and I paint one square at a time. I don't paint the whole painting. Only at the end, when it's all completed, I will introduce the airbrush again and I will tie on all the little squares together. So it's a very primitive way of enlarging something, but that's the system that I have. I was born with it, and I went to the academy when I was 14 years old, so I was brainwashed into it. It's like going to Catholic school, you know, you've been beaten into it, you can't help yourself. So everything that I learned in the academy, I apply almost every day. I forget that today you just have to have conceptual, you could be a conceptual artist, you don't need to know all the techniques in the world. But because I went to the academy for 6 years, I use them and I don't throw them away. So therefore I have a study, and I remember that one time I got a call from Jim Killett and he said to me, Uncle, you know, we need some smaller works of art in a gallery. We don't have any. In those days I worked on very large pieces, and I told him I don't have any. And one day when he was visiting me, he noticed one of the studies in the studio, and he said, what is that? I said, well, this is something that I use as a tool to make my paintings. But during the process of creation, it gets destroyed, it gets different paint on it. So he looked at me and says, you never heard of cellophane? I was amazed. So from that point on, I would take a study and I put cellophane on, then I take it to the studio, work with it to do a painting. So that's why we have studies, otherwise we would never have any studies. Yeah. So here we are. I am a person who was born in a country that does not exist anymore, called the Soviet Union. It's very embarrassing when my passport a few years ago, when I was refused entry back to the United States, the computer rejected it because my passport said I was born in USSR. The computer couldn't find a country by the name of USSR. Believe it or not, it's true. I had to reapply and had to change the word from USSR to Kazakhstan, which was a state when I was born. It was like being born in Texas, and you say, yeah. So I have two homes. One is in Israel and one is here. The one in Israel I occupy once or twice a year. I visit. I used to paint there, but it became very, very difficult to transport art from one country to another. So when I established my studio in New York, and then later on in Washington, I also created my main point of work, and I work every day, except when I travel. Even when I travel, I carry with me color pencils and stuff like this. So I make designs, and you may have seen me do little plates of people and so forth.
Oh,
That's kind of
that,
so
yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, so fun. Yeah, entertaining.
Where's a plate when you need it?
Yeah. And from that point on, I started exhibiting in the United States, first coming to this country by President Johnson's invitation. I've never really met him. I met Lyndon Johnson quite a few times, and his wife too, Lady Bird. And they sponsored my first exhibit in the United States. And through them, I met quite a few other famous people that kind of helped me in my first humble beginnings. One of them was Teddy Kennedy, which was also responsible for my citizenship, and Senator Frank Church, who was jointly with him responsible for it. And once I made myself slightly known in New York, I decided to visit Washington because of, as I mentioned before, the Colors group was working there, and the remaining two artists were still living at the time, Gene Davis and Berkowitz, and I went to visit them, saw something that I've not seen before, that really there is a special light in the city of Washington. I lived in New York, and the buildings kind of tend to change the light in the city. And Washington, by law, is not allowed to have a structure taller than the Washington Monument, which is barely 15 floors, you know. So the city had a different light, and I liked that. And at those days, we still painted during the day, trying to use the daylight, because the colors completely different when you use fluorescent lights or any kind of lights in the studio. It may not be noticeable for somebody who's a novice, but for somebody who's an artist and looks for very pure quarter tones of color, you need to have bright lights. It's like being tone deaf when you're listening to music, and many of the tones are just over your head, you never hear it. But when you're an artist, it bothers you, you need to have it. So I also can tell you by looking around which painting was painted in daylight, which painting was painted at night, and I'd be willing to make a bet and challenge the artist to prove to you that I'm right or wrong. So now I find myself in Washington, and I'm looking for a studio, find a studio. I have several exhibitions which were successful, and again, because of my political contacts, made it very easy for me to establish myself there. And obviously exhibiting as many places as I can. I had a museum show in Israel. I had actually two of those. But I have to go back to one incident, which strangely enough, I got an email recently from Lahaina Gallery in Florida, Palm Beach. I keep telling the story about when I was 14, when Marc Chagall came to Israel to install the famous Chagall windows. He decided to go to the academy, and I was not prepared for it. I didn't know anything about it. I was a kid. So he went to the academy, and apparently he asked the professors if there's any fire in this academy. And I guess they meant town. So they brought me out, introduced me to him. I was really not that impressed by him as a little guy. I also was not impressed because I really did not know him that well. As a 14-year-old kid, the history of art is still a mystery to you. You just know how to do certain things. And he looked at my work. He didn't say anything. He walked away. And I was devastated. I started reading about him, and I realized that he was a man that was not only a great artist, but also was a humanitarian, that he really loved being with young people and children. And it bothered me that after looking at my paintings, he walked away. So I stalked him I actually went to the hotel he stayed in. I didn't see him that time, but I saw his wife, Bella. And she came out and I said to her, you know, I was a little taken aback. I don't know if I should continue studying art or just walk away from it. The master didn't say anything to me, he just walked away. And I'm bewildered by it. She said, oh, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. In time he'll tell you. Well, I didn't know that 3 or 4 days later he was invited to the academy to do a speech for the community. And in that speech, he was looking for me. He says, where is Yanko? So I said, could you get up? I get up. And he says, he's pointing out at me, he says, it took me 40 years to conquer Paris. By the time this lad's hair becomes white, he'll conquer the world. So I'm dyeing my hair a little bit. Anyhow, it's an anecdote that I just told you, but strangely enough, somebody walked in to the gallery in Palm Beach, and I guess they have a couple of my pieces there, and he said, oh my God, I was in the Chagall Museum, and they keep telling the story of how Chagall did this, and it came to me through Jim Killett. Killett sent it to me. Who's Jim in the gallery there?
That's the husband of the director.
Of Diane.
Oh, that's what it is. So Jim sent it to Jim Killett, and Jim Killett. That's how it happened. Now I'll give you a little bit, because you're not going to read about my background. I was born in 1945, as you know, in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And my Christian name was Yuri Zhukov. I was 2 years old when my father suddenly decided that he needed to go look for his family. And not until that point I discovered that he was actually Jewish by hiding his identity as a Jew, because that was the only way he could actually marry my mother. My mother was the daughter of Marshal Zhukov, which is at the time, like Eisenhower was in this country, he was for the Russians. So there was a certain liability. So the fact that you came from a Jewish heritage was complete secret. And not until, and again, it's a very involved story. One day we'll sit, I'll tell you, if you want to read it, you can read it. If you want to watch the movie, you can watch the movie and see it. I was dumbfounded. I was shocked to find out that I am not who I am. So at age 14, when we fled the Soviet Union and we actually ended up in Israel, which was not our first choice, because my father was an invalid, and then we knew that Israel needed road builders. They didn't need intellectuals, and he was an intellectual writer. So he resisted coming there, but finally no country will take us because of the fact that we were Jewish, probably, we think. At least the United States rejected us because we were that. That's why I was made a citizen. I was made a citizen by a special act of Congress because they discovered that my father's application for political asylum was not granted because he was Jewish. It was discrimination, and that's why when Frank Church and and Kennedy and Senator McGovern found about it, and they were on the Foreign Relations Committee. That's when they initiated to make my family and myself a citizen by a special act of Congress. I accepted, my parents didn't because they felt that the damage has been done and so forth. But anyhow, at age 14 I converted to Judaism, and I was circumcised, and I learned yet another faith, being raised as a communist and then introduced to the Russian Orthodox faith and then now to Judaism. It was quite an experience. And all of that is somehow sprinkled throughout my art. You can see it. There's a little bewilderness, there's a loyalty, and there is everybody noted that my paintings are so much more optimistic than my life was, so much more bright. And I think it's because I'm personally very optimistic. Now, I did not read this, but somebody in my office read it and says that this is a little condensed, but you really don't need to know any more. You know, you just get experts from this, and it's chronicled about my military service even. I know it's not important for art, but sometimes people want to know where he came from, you know. What wars did he go to? And,
Yanko, can you share with us, a lot of people will see your work in the gallery and they go, well, it has to be a photograph. And they really would like to have an explanation of
right.
how
Well,
it's actually painted, because it's hard for them to get past the
Right.
fact that it
See,
looks
what
so
happens is it's
photographed.
because it's hyperrealism or it's photorealism. They don't realize that it's a school of art. And as I explained to you about photorealism, how it was born, I studied in the academy, and I studied to a point that for the first year and a half, we were not allowed to draw or paint anything that was live. It was inanimate object, a little box, glasses. And not until you could paint it to a point that the professor did not know the difference between reality and the object, you could continue painting live objects. So in my studies, we've learned how to mimic things to a point that it looks just real. We can do water. You come in and touch it because you think it's water.
Do you do it with one eye?
No, I don't know
You've
what I use because I know the principle behind it.
Right.
I knew it. Now, as I said, photorealism was the gimmick. The philosophy behind photorealism was that it was created by one-eye monster, and it creates dimensions by putting things out of focus. Hyperrealism is photorealism on steroids. You at will decide what's going to be in focus. All of it is in focus, and you create this dramatic composition. Now, when people come to me and they say, "Is that a photograph?" I say, "Thank you." See, I painted that way before Photoshop was invented. 11 years before Photoshop was invented. I was doing what people can do today in Photoshop. I mean, they can, but I don't see them do it at the degree that I'm doing it. And the explanation is very simple. It's like, I don't know if you know that the artist Rodin was accused throughout all of his life that he actually casted people. He didn't sculpt them. And he had to live through with that. Can you imagine that? Not until after his death that it was revealed that there was no such thing. But rumors, you know how it is. You got to fight them. But because I am photorealist, and because it looks so unbelievable, people don't buy it. Not until they come to my studio and they see how it's done. Just
Well,
as simple as that.
and that would be helpful to come to your studio, but not all of us can, and our
Well,
clients
but the
can't.
point is that when we do the art of when we do Yonkofest, we do that, you know.
Right.
And then you can,
Video
if
of
you
it.
take the time and see the video, you can actually see how it's done. It's explained point by point how
So
it's
do
done.
you use photographs, or
Sometimes you use photographs, but again,
Or are they
I don't use a
photographs?
photograph. The whole image is not. I use the flower, I do the leaf. Sometimes I just make it up. You know, with segments. It was like I traveled someplace. I think it was in Bulgaria, and I took a photograph of a little boat, tiny little boat. You know what a photograph with an instamatic camera looks like? I take it home and I make a composition. I put that boat because it's so beautiful, but the details are kind of poor. You know, so you make up the details. You do whatever you want. To say that we don't. You don't think this is influenced by a photograph somewhere?
Well-
Take a photograph to remember what you want.
Right,
a
right,
photograph
right.
in the 21st century substitutes a sketch, a drawing. An artist used to see something outside and draw it. And some of the greatest artists in the world use cameras to do their work. They painted the painting at the end, but if you study, have you ever read the book A Girl with a Pearl Earring? Well, look at his work. I mean, his work is photography, and he photographed first the images, then create. Look at Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell painted everything for photograph. Everything is staged, and actors were posing, and he photographed it. Then he painted it. What's the difference? How it's
So
done?
you use the photographs as inspiration, but there's no photograph
There is
in
no,
your work.
Exactly. If you look at the painting, like this one here, right?
Mm-hmm.
The glass may be from a photograph. The pants may be from another photograph. The hat may be. The person may be just made up altogether. That never happened. It depends on what I want to do. You know, but you have to have some. I sometimes go through a magazine and, oh my God, this is so beautiful. And I take that segment that influenced me. It could be a little segment of a crease. I love it, and I put it somewhere in the painting. But how can you be blind to things around you? You can't be. Some people have, you know, earlier in my life, I had a photographic memory, so I could remember if things were, but I can't, you know, so I go with me everywhere. Something strikes me, I take a little snapshot of it, come back to the studio, and work around it. Right?
I think there may have been some confusion. I don't know. A few years ago, there was information that was given to us that they are photographs,
Who
or
gave you that information?
that there are photographs in the images, and then you also create
Well,
paint on top of that.
No, I use everything is painted. Everything is
Okay.
painted with airbrush. But I use segments of it. Like for example, if I wanted to paint Pamela, I will use a photograph because she's not available to sit in the studio. But I will make up some of the clothing. I will make up the background and so forth. But there's nothing wrong with relying on exterior
Sure.
things. You can't have everything in your
It
pocket.
says mixed media, so besides the paint, some of the pieces.
Well,
are
mixed media
right?
could be for different reasons. I don't know. You will see behind the paintings come from the studio. If it says mixed media, it's usually two different medias put together. It could be a watercolor and acrylic, or
okay.
it could be a print that's painted over.
Okay.
But the mixed media, if you look behind my paintings, it's from the label. The label in the back will tell you what it is.
Okay.
And most of the time, it's acrylic on wood. And why do I use wood? Why not canvas? For the same reason that I told you before, because canvas gives me unintended shadows because of the texture of the weave. But the wood that I buy, which is like petrified wood, it's not really petrified wood, but it has the same proprieties. In other words, it will not bend in any which way. It's commercially built, and then it's created to serve artists by putting gessos on it, and unlike wood, that if you expose it to moisture, it will bend one way or another. This will not, because it's glued. It's shaves of wood that are glued and glued permanently, just like this here. If you expose it to moisture, it will bend because you can see it's wood. But if it was not wood, if it was if it was grounded and then glued with glue, it will not be wood. It will be now, yes, wood inside, but it's no longer same properties. And then after it's sanded and after the gesso is made on it, artists go to stores and buy it, and you can paint on it. And the reason I buy wood instead of canvas is because the surface that I paint of is very smooth, as smooth as this. So when I draw on it and I make all the different designs and all the different details, like droplets and so forth, if it was any texture in it, you will see unintended shadows, and it will take away from the illusion of what it is. And it's exactly what we do, create illusions on canvases, on paint. Like Aldo's is impressionist, so he can just suggest, I am hyper-realist. I can't suggest, I have to show it to you precisely. Otherwise it defeats the purpose of what it is. Some people love hyper-realism or photorealism, some people don't like it. It's too real for them. It's a photograph. Well, if it's a photograph, why don't you do it yourself? Get a camera, photograph it.
Does anybody have any questions for Yanko?
No.
Sorry.
But please do. I'm going to be here for a few days, so every time I come, anything comes across, when you see the art, especially before the exhibit, once it's hanged,
Okay.
if you see something in a painting that you need to inquire, you just call me aside and I will explain to you what it is. Or eavesdrop on me when I talk to other people, you know. By the way, this is a photograph from Penn State University that I just recently had a lecture, and also an unveiling, an installation of my photorealistic paintings. They have actually a segment of the museum. And this is a statue, monument,